Hello, my name is Neil Glickman, and this is how my sign name is produced. I am a psychologist by trade, and I've been in the field for about 30 years now. I've worked mainly in the field that I refer to as deaf mental health care, or DMHC. A little bit more about myself. I am hearing, and I first learned sign language back in 1979 when I attended a summer sign language immersion program at Gallaudet College. I became pretty fascinated with the language and made the decision to move to Washington, D.C., and I worked at Gallaudet for one year with the purpose of interacting with the deaf community and acquiring more language. I did go to grad school and graduated in 1983. Since that time, I've worked in a variety of positions. I started out as working as a vocational rehabilitation counselor, and later I had the opportunity with several colleagues to set up a deaf psych hospital program at Westboro State Hospital. I worked there for a total of 17 years and later became the psychology unit director. The vast majority of my experience there at the hospital was great. I've had a variety of experience in clinical programs, including outpatient programs, private practice, emergency room sessions in which I would conduct assessments with folks in crisis. And finally, for 6 years, I worked at a program called Advocates, Inc. And that program provided psych services for folks in group homes. Some individuals did live independently in an apartment, and the team would go out and provide assistance to them there. This webinar will focus on the topic of counseling therapy as it relates to working with deaf individuals, some of which have language deprivation. Language deprivation can be best explained in this way. Suppose you're a deaf child growing up, relying on your residual hearing to learn spoken language. Perhaps the child has had a cochlear implant. Maybe they can hear some sound, but not clearly hear the words. Or perhaps they can hear some words in simple statements, but not complex language comprehension. That results in a spoken language delay. Working in tandem with that, the deaf child may grow up with some sign language exposure, but not necessarily have a good, strong language role model for that child to gain proficiency in the language. Then the child experiences language gaps in both spoken language and sign language, which can result in serious issues. And I can see two therapy challenges as it relates to language. So for example, let's suppose you're the director of a clinical program. Perhaps you have a group of hearing clinic speaks Japanese, which leads to some obvious barriers, a language barrier and a cultural barrier. However, at the same time, you can assume something about the Japanese-speaking client. You can assume that they have full native language use. They've acquired their native language. Although there's not a shared language between the participants, you can assume that they have a full language. However, let's suppose that you're the director of a clinic and you have all hearing individuals there where no one signs, and a deaf person shows up using sign language. You can't automatically assume that they have full language acquisition. Perhaps some, yes, some may be fluent signers, others may not. Some may be experiencing language deprivation. In working with someone who signs fluently versus a person that has language delays, is not the same. It is much more difficult to work with someone who has language delays and trying to determine communication. It's often a guessing game as to what to do, and that's what this webinar will focus on today. I would like to begin the webinar with showing you a story that I found on YouTube. The story is about a boy by the name of Patrick. Patrick grew up in Africa, in the country of Uganda. Growing up, Patrick had no formal education. He had no language learning. Let's watch that story now.
Patrick Otema is 15 years old. He was born deaf, but in this remote region of northern Uganda, there are no schools for deaf children. In his whole life, Patrick's never had a conversation.
Hello. Good?
His father, Charles, looks after him. They are only able to communicate through very basic gestures.
We've been sitting here talking about Patrick in front of him, and while he's been watching us, he doesn't understand what we're saying. It feels almost rude. But this is what Patrick's life is like all the time.
I'm here with someone who wants to change all that. Raymond Okello is deaf himself and a sign language teacher.
Do you think he could learn sign language? This is pretty much Patrick's existence. His father gestures to him what he wants him to do, and when he's finished, he goes back to his hut to spend the rest of the day on his own.
Patrick's fate is not unusual. The majority of deaf people in sub-Saharan Africa have never been taught sign language. Unable to communicate with others, they are trapped in their own minds. Raymond became deaf as a child after a bout of malaria. 6 months ago, he travelled to the capital for intensive training in sign language. Now he's returned to his village to do something unprecedented. He's going to teach the first sign language course ever set up here.
Raymond, are you nervous?
It's 2 o'clock. The first deaf students start turning up.
Patrick's transformation is amazing. It's almost impossible to believe it's the same boy we met yesterday.
New deaf students keep arriving. Many have walked miles to be here. There's a 9-year-old boy and an 80-year-old woman. Before the end of the class, each new student goes to the front. The class votes on a new name for them. This is now Patrick's sign name, and he will use it for the rest of his life. He has just been baptized into a whole new world.
That story is quite heartrending. Obviously, sign language became quite a gift to him. As an adolescent, Patrick is finally picking up sign language, and his life changed. Really, his life just began. But now, moving forward from that point, you have to pose the question, will he become a fluent language user? Perhaps he'll make improvements in his language, but would he be considered a native user? Probably not. He's already missed those critical language learning years and has quite a bit of delays in his language. So I have to ask you the question. Let's suppose Patrick's father decided to move them to America. Upon arriving here, can you foresee that Patrick may encounter a few issues? And what do you think those might be? I'd like to share 2 other stories with you. Both come from my book, Deaf Mental Health Care. The first story was written by Karen Bishop. She works as the director for the Walden School, which is in conjunction with the Learning Center for Deaf Children in Framingham, Massachusetts. Karen wrote a narrative about a boy by the name of Robert. Robert grew up on the island of Haiti. Similar to Patrick's upbringing, Robert had no formal schooling, nor did he have any language. Finally, at age 10, he moved to the United States. When he was in Haiti, he went back and forth between different villages. He had no structure, and people took turns acting as his caregiver, but he was mostly wild. When he arrived in America, he was not prepared for life here. He was placed into a mainstream public classroom. As you can imagine, having no language and going into that environment, we can only assume what he was feeling, whether it be fear or being overwhelmed about what was happening. And of course, behavioral issues ensued: blowing up, fighting, bullying behaviors. In fact, one incident occurred in which one day he showed up at school with a knife threatening people, and of course frightening those at the school. Of course, there is a weapon ban at schools, and he was suspended. At home, Robert had the same sort of issues, running wild around Boston, stealing, fighting, and his mom wasn't able to keep him in control. Eventually, he transferred to the Walden School, and so at age 10, he is in his first sign language environment and his first opportunity to learn language. He already has huge delays and many problems showing up. So imagine yourself as the therapist. Where would you begin? Another story is about a boy that I will call Omar. The story is based on several interactions that people have had with him, so I'd like to protect his confidential information. I first met Omar at age 20. He is Hispanic American. He grew up here in America with a single mom that had 3 children, and Omar was the only deaf child. Mom really struggled to earn a living and support her family. And then when she had a deaf son, Mom was completely unprepared for that and became quite overwhelmed. She was already struggling to survive, and Omar experienced some neglect growing up because of that. Also, some of the men in the house were not great role models. I know one boyfriend of the mother abused her, and Omar saw that growing up and perhaps copied some of those behaviors. He had very little English and Spanish language exposure. He had no sign language exposure, and he had ongoing aggressive behaviors. He eventually transferred to the School for the Deaf, where those behaviors continued to surface. At age 16, a new problem arose, and that was related to sexual behaviors. He would approach girls, touch them inappropriately, try to kiss them, and his sexual behaviors caused quite a bit of trouble, and there was concern about him becoming a sex offender. So he was placed in the hospital, and as I mentioned earlier, I worked at Westboro State Hospital, which fortunately does have a deaf services program. And that's where Omar and I first met and began working together. He eventually did transfer back to the School for the Deaf and graduate. Fortunately, the state of Massachusetts has several group homes that have sign language environments. And so Omar was placed in a group home and his sign language communication eventually improved. It was never stellar, but it did improve. He was able to get counseling at his various placements, whether it be at the deaf school or the hospital or the group home, but he still faced quite a bit of challenges, and that had to do with his delays and many gaps. His behavioral issues were already severe by that point. And I do want to make you aware, the experiences of Patrick and Robert and Omar are not unique. When you're in the field of deaf mental health care, you will encounter people like them. Many clients and many students have similar experiences as them. People growing up without language exposure experience delays and oftentimes experience trauma, abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, other issues such as poverty, and they grow up with several issues and gaps in their language. Perhaps you've met some individuals like this before. But we have to consider, how do we proceed? How do we help? Many years later, I ran into Omar again. He's now living in a group home, and he's been making progress with his language, but he's still not great as a language user. For example, he had made one comment. Omar had been arguing with someone, and I came in and asked Omar, "Hey, what's been going on? What's this argument about?" Omar responded back to me, "Me mad. Blow up. Bother, bother, bother." And that was it. He said, "Me mad. Blow up. Bother, bother, bother." Is that clear? It's not a clear story. There's obvious gaps there. Who is bothering who? What happened prior to the incident? What happened afterwards? It's an example of a half statement. Although many years later, in which Omar has improved with his language, when he first started, he had no language, so now he is able to have some commentary, but as a therapist, it's unclear as to what to do. So we'll continue to discuss that later in this presentation. Before I go on, I want to talk a little bit about deaf mental health care. If you provide therapy with deaf patients, it's important to provide a culturally supportive environment, whether it be a school or a hospital, group home, or what have you. A signing program, a language-rich program, and a program that's going to support deaf people and their cultural community. That environment makes our work possible. I'm very fortunate that throughout my life, I've worked in environments, programs that provide a signing program, and that as a therapist, as a part of that program, it's much easier. This work must include respect, support, and a culturally sensitive environment, especially as a hearing person. I myself am hearing. You must work with humility. You cannot come in and expect to take over and assert power. It's about having a collaborative, supportive, empowering approach. We have to remember that as hearing people, as outsiders to the community, we work with privilege. We have to be invited in to be involved in the community. The attitude is paramount to that. Now many deaf children have cochlear implants, and people assume that sign language is not needed. Most frequently, sign language is still necessary for those children. Even though some children with cochlear implants proceed all right, they may learn some spoken language, rely on some hearing. But again, with a cochlear implant, they may now hear sound. It doesn't mean that they're getting language input. Perhaps they can comprehend simple words. It doesn't mean that complex language learning is happening. There are often still language delays. Some may have minimal exposure to sign language, but it doesn't mean that they sign well. It doesn't mean that they're exposed to fluent language users to where they're able to acquire American Sign Language, which causes a language delay in sign communication. And again, cochlear implants may be beneficial, but a signing environment is equally important. When working in deaf mental health care, you'll meet many people who are fluent signers. They sign beautifully, they have sophisticated language. However, you'll encounter those that have severe communication deficits, which is a big challenge. I'd like to share some research that was conducted at Westboro State Hospital. If you recall, I did spend 17 years of my career there. Westboro State Hospital had a deaf program, and they always had someone in the role of communication specialist. And the person with that job was to assess the sign language proficiency of the deaf patients, as well as assist with ensuring that communication was being met. We had many documented communication abilities amongst our patients. And later I worked with a colleague, a psychology intern at the time, by the name of Patricia Black. She was very interested in language proficiency and wanted to conduct research related to the communication assessments. Over the course of her analysis, she found something quite interesting. In reviewing 7 years' worth of communication assessments for 94 deaf patients, her analysis found that 2/3 were language disfluent users. Certainly, they were functional. Most had some sign skills and they were able to get by, but they did not have fluent language use. They had significant language deficits, and 2/3 is a large amount of people. I want to look at what that means for us. Let me give you some examples. First, related to vocabulary, many of the patients would have vocabulary for things, tangible items, concrete concepts. They would have that vocabulary, but more complex vocabulary was lacking. Grammar vocabulary structure was lacking. Sometimes the vocabulary was used incorrectly. So, for example, with time concepts or use of tense. American Sign Language has many ways to set up time concepts. Some examples include not yet, finished, future, just recently, a little while ago, some time ago, next year, 2 weeks ago, 2010, next week Tuesday. It's quite easy to set up time concepts in American Sign Language. But this particular group struggled with time concepts, meaning that in dialogue it was never clear. Is this something that happened recently or quite some time ago? Is it something that will be happening? The clarity was missing. Also, there were important informational items that were missing. Who are you talking about? Who did what to who? That information was often confused or lacking. American Sign Language also often follows the topic comment structure. So, for example, this topic comment structure would be the following. Yesterday, my mom chewed me out. The topic, my mom, the comment, chewed me out. Or my boss was horribly strict. I didn't like that. Again, the topic comment structure is clear. In deaf culture, it's always important to be clear about who or what is being talked about. So while deaf people are having a conversation and someone may come in to join, a person will pause and let them know, hey, we're talking about this. And then the newcomer joins in with the conversation. It's always important to set the topic. But here within this group, oftentimes the topic was not clear. Who, what, where, when? That information was confused or absent or weak. Also, the grammar was not there, which means that the language difficulties related to language deprivation often results in language that looks disorganized or confused. Pat Black found that more than half of our deaf patients were unable to tell a clear linear story. Can you imagine? In explaining what happened, information became confused, and staff often would struggle to have a clear understanding of what exactly had occurred. You know that if you're unable to tell a story, that means that some cognitive concepts and structures are weak. So, for example, cause and effect. If-then concepts. The relationship between A and B. Abstract concepts of the like are weak. Staff found that glance, it appears that there had been a male patient that had some inappropriate sexual touch with her. But the story was not clear. Staff struggled to understand who's involved. Did this just happen? Is there concern that it need communication experts? Gesture, role play, drawing, arguing, and drawing out some of those finer details of the story. Eventually, we were able to kind of know what happened, but still we weren't fully confident in the story. The point being that when this situation arises, we know that we need to have communication experts. That it is too easy to have misunderstandings, and that even the communication experts struggle with knowing exactly what happened. Language deprivation affects thinking. Abstract thinking is weak. The ability to see patterns, for example, the connection between A, B, and C, is weak. The ability to connect past, present, and future is weak. This is a story from a group home where I worked with one man that had aggressive behavior. His name was George. George had a staff member that worked with him by the name of Bill that would help him with cooking, grocery shopping, and whatnot. There was one day in which George became mad and pushed Bill, who fell over, and then he hit him. So naturally, Bill felt very scared and decided to leave. Later on, Bill was not willing to return to work with George. We had other staff on the team, but after hearing the story about what had happened with George with hitting and pushing Bill, the remainder of the team was unwilling to go see George as well, which means that effectively George's team dissociated themselves with him. So I approached George and I asked to see if we could sit down and chat. And I had asked him, I said, I need you to help me. We have a problem. Do you think you can help me? So we began to discuss. And I brought up the fact that he had recently hit Bill. And I asked him about what had happened. And he proceeded to explain. And I let him know, how do you think Bill's feeling right now? And George's response was, I don't care. And I let him know that Bill was no longer willing to come back and support him, that he was feeling fearful. And I asked him, where's your support now? And George said, oh, some of the other staff will come. I said, well, the problem is that they don't want to come either. How do you think they might be feeling? They're actually feeling fearful too. And George responded, well, I haven't hit any of the other staff members. They should come. I only hit Bill. I didn't hit any of the others. I let him know that no, all of them are afraid of you. George really struggled to make those connections about how his behaviors with one person impacted the behaviors of others. I let him know, hey, George, this is the problem. Your team is now withdrawn from being willing to work with you. What are we going to do now? I need your help with solving this. We continued to talk at length before we could finally work up to him being willing to apologize and repair the relationship. But he was unable to make that connection between how his behavior with one person impacted his behavior with others. Again, that sense of cause and effect was weak. Also, his ability to understand the perspectives of others was quite weak. Language deprivation also affects how much information a person has. A psychologist by the name of Robert Pollard talks about the phenomenon of fund of information, or FOI. How much information a person has. Oftentimes, deaf people can be behind in the amount of information they have about the world. It's not easy to pick up for them. They're unable to rely on the hearing to pick up information about the world. Sometimes they have reading difficulty, which leads to them being further behind. And they may be missing out on basic information about the world. For example, health, physical health, taking care of one's body. Health and sickness, mental health. The concept of mental health is completely foreign. What does that mean? The concept is foreign. Often, sexual issues and sexuality is lacking in their information. Maybe they never received sex education. I oftentimes find myself shocked about the gaps in basic information regarding intercourse, pregnancy, sexually transmitted diseases, safe sex, or even the concept of safe sex. Many have never heard of that before. There's a lot of information gaps there. And also related to sexuality in terms of negotiation, ensuring both partners feel comfortable and consent. The idea of consent is information that they may have never been taught or even had the opportunity to understand, and they find themselves behind. Oftentimes, they don't know about information related to their mental health history, diet, healthy habits, vocational preparation, meaning how to get along with your coworkers. What are your expectations, such as showing up in a timely manner and having a positive attitude? Information related to independent living skills, such as cooking, budgeting, grocery shopping. Even things such as family information. Who are the members of your family? Seemingly basic information. I have met people that may know their mom, their dad, their siblings, but in terms of extended family members, such as uncles, aunts, and cousins, they often find themselves unawares. They don't know their names or background information, and they find themselves quite behind with basic information. Also in terms of counseling and therapy, they don't understand what that is. Perhaps they believe counseling means someone telling you what to do, what the rules are, the things that you must follow along with. They don't understand the concept of counseling as a time to sit down and problem solve together. They don't have familiarity with that. Those information gaps really affect our work we do. It's important that we have counseling therapists who sign. It's critical. The ability to work well with every deaf person will vary across the board. I myself am able to sign, and if a deaf client signs well and we're able to sit down and dialogue, I will feel that I can provide therapeutic services. However, in the situation of someone like Omar, Robert, or Patrick, I wouldn't be a good fit. I would need some help. I would need some communication assistance. Really, most of us signing therapists need assistance. We can't work alone. It's important to have the attitude of humility and really have a good self-assessment of my skills. I can communicate well with a person who is a fluent signer, but that's not the same as trying to communicate with someone that experiences language deprivation. It's two different skills. Perhaps a fluent signer would find myself to be a good communication match, but someone with language deprivation, I would not be a good communication match. That's why, for the most part, we should be working in teams. And having that attitude of humility is important to recognize that if I would like to help someone, I may need the assistance of another person, perhaps an interpreter, or two interpreters, or even a deaf interpreter. I want to ensure that I'm meeting their communication needs as best as possible. In our field, sometimes people work alone. It's a challenge to hire someone that signs to work with deaf people and then saddle them with the pressure of meeting the communication needs of everyone. They feel the need to become super therapists. And I want to caution you to be careful with that. None of us are super therapists. To assume we'd be able to work with every single person to understand their issues, that I'd have the skill set to address that and their communication, that's not always the case. That's why we need to have a team approach, not only assessing the client's language needs, but our own language skills to ensure that communication match is happening and understanding what we need. So again, that's why I like to emphasize the team approach, no one working alone. Now I'd like to discuss counseling therapy, and I have 6 different points that I'll expand upon. The first 2 things to consider as a therapist, how we theorize the work. Our theories, our model, what that looks like. Secondly is the skill of what we do, the techniques we use. First, the theory. Understanding that this is developing, meaning that the group of individuals with language deprivation are developing. They're behind with their language, they're behind cognitively, they have social skill gaps. Meaning I have to think to myself, how can I meet the needs of a person who is still developing in the area of language, cognitive, and social skills? I have to consider that developmental model. Then I have to consider what type of techniques I would use. What do deaf-friendly techniques look like? That's something I'll continue to touch upon. The first issue is when a person who is deaf is referred to me. Should I automatically accept that client? The answer is actually quite complex. If you remember the situation with Omar, he didn't learn sign language until adolescence. But later, he was quite fortunate. He was at a deaf school. He was at a program in a hospital that had a deaf unit. That's quite rare. Later on, he was placed in a group home that was a language-rich environment. Each of those placements provided therapy to him, and he benefited from being in a sign language environment. I worked with him in the last 2 of those placements. The environment provided him language access, which made therapy easier. I couldn't do it alone. If he was in an environment where there was no sign language immersion, and I expected to do counseling and that be the only therapy he received, that should not be acceptable. Should counseling become the priority issue there? Oftentimes, people are just looking for someone that can sign, oh, and let me automatically refer you. But there's no language-rich environment to support that person day to day. So it's important that I remain in the attitude of humility, doing that assessment of, can I meet their communication needs? Will my abilities meet their needs? If I do decide to take them on as a client, do I have a team I can rely on to provide support to them? I don't want to give the assumption that a person can come to therapy and they don't need the language-rich environment. I do not want to enable that assumption that people think the signing therapist is good enough. A client that has language deprivation must have a language-rich environment to support them to be able to go into counseling effectively. It may be best that we advocate for them to have a signing environment before we advocate the addition of counseling. We want to make sure that language-rich environment will support them to go to counseling later on. It's a difficult question to answer. If you accept a client and the client is willing, again, using the developmental model, I know that the client and I would be working on development, language development, cognitive development. If you remember Omar, he made his statement, me mad, blow up, bother, bother, bother. That statement's unclear. So I know that I begin the process of drawing out the remainder of the story. You were angry. What happened? Who bothered you? Did someone else bother you? Were you bothering another person? What happened? What exactly was this bothering looking like? Did someone push you, look down upon you, insult you? What happened? What happened prior to the incident? What happened afterwards? Tell me the story. You begin to draw out the details. A lot of our work is really pulling out the details, letting them tell the story. That allows language development and cognitive development. Remember that stories have a structure. We learn to use language. We learn to think with stories. Stories have a beginning, middle, and end. They have a natural process. People in the stories move through time. There are characters in the story, what's being talked about, the people in the story, and there's a sequence. There's a topic which transitions to another topic, and so forth. Things happen, people react, people have behaviors, feelings. All of that is explored. Relationships are explored. All of that happens within a story. And in therapy, we often use storytelling for many therapeutic purposes. In this particular situation, it's facilitating language development as well as cognitive development. Sometimes a lot of our work is, tell me a story. Okay, what happened next? And what about after that? Well, what did you do? What did the other person do? And you begin to draw out that story. And perhaps eventually you work on the story with cognitive development and structure. Sometimes I find that using dominoes is helpful when doing storytelling therapy. I say, okay, what happened first? Then refer to the next domino, and next, and so on and so forth. As the story moves forward, typically the last point is the blow up. So we have first, second, third, fourth, fifth, so on. The dominoes go down, and that leads to the person blowing up. That helps the client make connections with time. Sometimes I find it helpful. Remember my model. I'm working with the developmental model. I know that the client lacks information. Therefore, part of my role is to provide information and instruction as much as possible to help the client learn about the world. Also, I have them involved in learning different psychosocial skills, especially two in particular. One being feelings and modulation of those feelings related to coping skills, and also social skills. I often find those two to be quite challenging for people. Information that we may discuss, whatever the topic may be, such as basic information related to making friends, relationships, dating, sexuality, alcohol, drugs. It could be any topic that a person is unfamiliar with. Let me give you an example. The concept of depression. Perhaps a person understands the concept of sadness and feeling sad, but they don't have the correlation to depression. So I may use pictures to explain. I would go through a list of items that color depression. So for example, you may be sad, but the sadness doesn't go away. It's an ongoing sadness. A person may no longer be able to attend to something. They may be inattentive, daydream, unable to focus. The person may have a lack of motivation or inability to enjoy themselves. A person may feel ambivalent. Perhaps they perseverate on negative thoughts. They disconnect and withdraw from people. They think about death and sadness. They may engage in self-harm behaviors such as cutting. They may attempt suicide. Perhaps even their movements are slow and lethargic. They're feeling low energy. Perhaps they avoid people, prefer to be isolated. People who feel depressed may stay in bed for days on end. They're unable to get up. Sometimes they may be restless to the point of inability to sleep. Occasionally, their appetite may increase and they overeat and lead to gaining of weight. Others may shun food and have extreme weight loss. Sexual appetite may decrease as well. And so I'd explain to the client, depression looks like these things. Do you have any of these? And we may go check through the list to find out. Those particular symptoms are called depression. And we have a discussion about that. I can never assume that the concept of depression is already known. Most concepts related to mental health have to be explained at depth and taught. A lot of that basic life information may be missing for that person. So we have to find a way to communicate that. If you remember Omar, the two of us had a lot of discussions in therapy related to meeting a woman, how to meet a woman. We talked about sexual assault at length and what exactly that meant. Harm to women, how to approach a woman in the appropriate way. A lot of our discussion revolved around consent and how to communicate clearly with a potential partner, making sure that consent was received. We also discussed about inappropriate touch towards a woman and what that woman may feel. Omar never considered another person's feelings prior to that. We in therapy may discuss any person's issues related to their needs, something that they haven't experienced before. Maybe they're discussing it for the very first time. One important skill development is the ability to express themselves with language. And if you'll look at the pictures on the next slide, I've used this a lot to encourage a person to use language to express themselves, to not blow up or use behavior to express themselves, but using language and finding a safe way to communicate information and to practice that again and again. Expressing themselves safely. Whenever that does occur, I praise them. Wow, you've done a great job. You're communicating your feelings. You're expressing yourself without blowing up, without causing another person injury. I like how you're using language. That's so nice. That's an ongoing process to continue to pull out that expressing oneself safely skill. Now I want to talk about some techniques that can be used. I have what I like to call deaf-friendly techniques, 3 specifically. One is use of pictures and visual supports. Naturally, whenever a person has poor language skills, perhaps poor reading and writing skills, pictures become important for communication. There are many pictures now available out there. I have a colleague that's a deaf artist by the name of Mike Krasnick. He has drawn hundreds of pictures that are called skill cards. They're available to use with people. They show different concepts, a variety of skills, and I rely on those all the time. If you look online, you can find pictures for most everything. So let me give you an example. Breathing skills. Using breathing as a coping mechanism. It works well for everyone, and everyone needs that. Breathing skills are not dependent upon language. Everyone can breathe and learn that skill to help them. And you're able to show how important it is as a coping mechanism. Whether agitated or upset, one can pause and breathe. I find it very helpful for most people. I personally use it all the time when I find myself agitated or angry. I'm able to pause and breathe. The next slide, perhaps you've seen it before, called the red, yellow, green light skill, or the traffic light skill. I've used that with hundreds of people. Perhaps it seems simple, the red, yellow, green, the red meaning stop and notice. Whenever someone's agitated or angry, stop to notice, what am I feeling? Is it anger, sad, upset, anxiety, embarrassment? We work a lot to help people understand their internal feelings and also recognizing their behaviors. Am I ready to blow up? Can I stop myself before I blow up? Can I pay attention to what I'm doing? What's triggering those feelings? And I begin to acknowledge that and put that attention on that, and people can focus on their internal world and start giving those feelings a name, labeling those feelings and those experiences. The yellow light means to calm down. Perhaps that includes a breathing technique. Maybe it means taking a break, going for a walk, sitting in a rocking chair, watching television, something to allow themselves to cool down. And when they cool down, come back, and now they think, what am I going to do? What will I choose? Practicing these 3 items helps many people, and modeling seems to help many people. Thinking skills means the ability to talk to oneself. Again, it's often weak with those who experience language deprivation. So for example, talking to oneself, I'm mad. I don't like that behavior. I'm ready to blow up, but I don't want trouble. I don't want to go to jail. I don't want staff to be angry with me. I don't want them to be upset with me. I can cool down. I can use my thinking skills. I can use my coping skills. I can calm down. We practice that a lot. It helps an individual to sit and talk to themselves. Sometimes they begin practicing by copying myself. And as they practice, they develop that ability to use their mind to think about what they're doing. The next slide is related to shielding skills. Again, many people find this helpful. A client such as Omar may experience someone picking on him, bothering him, insulting him, giving him a hard time. And we give him an option. What do? Do you fight and get angry, or do you use that shielding skill? And shielding skill is more of blowing it off, recognizing that it's not important, not allowing those behaviors to affect his own behavior and being resistant towards that, walking away. Using that skill requires practice. Clearly, it'd be done during role play in which we practice that. And many of people have told me, I used my shielding skills. I didn't blow up. I've studied many different conflict resolution approaches, and one I like is called nonviolent communication. There's a lot of good skills within that one. And one in particular that I like is called clean communication, meaning you practice discussing what happened, and there are no threats, no blaming, no criticism within that discussion. It is solely a neutral discussion. It's something that has to be practiced. You can practice communicating well with one another without having to insult someone or make them feel bad about themselves. Another important skill is called I statements, meaning When you do blank, I feel bad about myself. So rather than yelling at someone or blowing up, you use those I statements. For example, whenever you hurt my feelings, or you insult me, or you threaten me, I feel bad about myself. I don't feel motivation to come and work with you, and I don't want that to happen. I want us to be partners. I want us to be a team. So when you insult me, I feel like I want to withdraw from helping you. So we use that sometime to work with clients that have insultative behaviors, perhaps racially charged insults. And so we discuss insulting others makes them feel as though they want to withdraw from you and leave you alone. Is that something you want? And then I request their help. Help me figure out how to work as a team, how to be collaborative. What do we do? So those I statements are a useful skill. Another deaf-friendly technique is role-playing. I know that in deaf mental health care, most therapists in the counseling role use that all the time, probably more so than hearing therapy sessions. Especially with language deprivation, we have to do role-playing and acting out of scenarios. Let me give you an example. At the group home, perhaps a client walks up to staff and wants their attention right now, immediately, but the staff is overwhelmed. They have several clients in which they're trying to attend to, and they're unable to take a break to focus on a sole client. That's an opportunity for us to practice role-playing. So when you walk up to staff, you notice that they're busy. You see that they're working with other people who need help. So you think to yourself, well, I can wait. Perhaps you ask for an appointment for later on. Maybe ask the staff, hey, in a half hour, can we sit down and have a chat? Agree upon a time, and then walk away. That type of practice and that sort of skill, waiting skills, attention skills, the red, yellow, green skills, those are all practiced during role play. And in deaf mental health care, we do that often. And we do that practice together. I've mentioned skills a lot. This work is not a lot about internal understanding of themselves, but it's more focused on skills, using those skills for clarity. Two skills that are often discussed first are the skills to pay attention, to label feelings, and some understanding is involved with that, but it's more of acknowledgement and understanding of feelings, being able to manage those. And the second is related to interactions with others, having those social skills. We often focus on those two groups of skills. And you may ask yourself why we decide to focus on those skills. One is that having those skills make it easier to explain the therapy. Therapy means that we're working on skills together. You can find pictures for helping navigate those skills. You can practice those together. How to invite others to practice with one another. Also, that skill practice can lead to the world of cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. Cognitive behavioral therapy is involved a lot with our sessions. As skills are mastered, and that person is willing to work on those skills, then the world opens up for CBT to be used. The sixth and final part relates to relationships. All counseling depends on relationships and empathy. We build a rapport with our clients by being able to empathize. A lot of times we use statements such as, you seem to feel sad or angry. Do you mind telling me? I'd like to hear more about what's going on. Trying to empathize through communication without judgment and having a better understanding. It's, please invite me in. tell me more. Regardless of who the client is, that's a general counseling technique. It's important to not use power or control. Many people who experience language deprivation growing up live in a world with lots of rules. Perhaps it's no structure or overly structured. A person in power tells them the rules, what they can or can't do. If they don't follow the rules, then they're punished. But they never learn how to think for themselves. Rule-oriented living does not build skills. It doesn't develop problem-solving abilities. They don't learn how to calm down. And so stepping out of controlling a person rather than promoting skill development is the way to go. I recommend working from an attitude of one down. Meaning, well, let me give you an example. Inviting, not telling, but inviting. For example, are you all right if we sit down and chat right now? Are you available? I need some help. Do you mind sitting down and chatting with me and giving me some advice? What do you think? I'm curious. Would you mind sitting down and telling me? Are you willing to help? Oftentimes with asking permission to begin a conversation shows respect, and they feel more involved in the meeting. The power differential lessens. Oftentimes, the client cooperates better. Oftentimes, they find themselves in a program or environment where staff is constantly in control, telling them something, punishing them, it's rule-governed. And as a result, that can actually cause the blow-ups and aggression to become worse. But a lot of times, working from that one-down attitude of, what do you think? And inviting them in works much better. Counseling therapists should have curiosity. We should be curious about people, especially about positive behaviors, their abilities, their skills. A good principle to employ is that whenever a person does something well, the therapist should become curious about it. Oh, you successfully calmed down. You were able to de-escalate yourself. You found a job. You were able to do something independently. How did that happen? Explain to me. Showing curiosity about the client's abilities. Being curious about those positive behaviors make it easier down the road to discuss some of the more negative issues. We show that we care about their strengths and abilities in a positive manner. Hey, tell me about that. Sometimes when someone engages in a quote-unquote bad behavior, we don't want to scold them. Instead, we want to worry together and use strategic worrying. For example, hey, I'm a little bit worried. Do you know why I'm worried? That's right. I know you've been stealing things. You know what I'm worried about? What might happen? You could be in trouble. Perhaps the police would get involved and arrest you. What might happen? Or, hey, that bullying behavior, insulting and hurting people, I'm worried that others will withdraw from you, and I'm worried that you would be alone and I would be unable to help you. That worries me. Or, hey, this insultative behavior, I'm worried that my motivation to come work with you will lessen and your ability to receive help will suffer as a result. I want to work together. Can you help me? Always ask for help. That is the best way to confront a problem. Not fussing, maybe helping them think about consequences and asking the question, what do we do? In general, asking questions is better than telling people. Asking question promotes thinking skills, for individuals who oftentimes grow up not being encouraged to do so. And it allows them to develop problem-solving abilities. By just simply telling, it creates dependency. We want the person to start thinking about problem-solving skills and doing that together. Asking good questions. For example, if a person did something well, you were able to de-escalate and calm yourself down without fighting. I noticed that you two were able to cooperate together well. You got along and you're friends. And you have friends now. What are you doing? How are you making those friendships? What skills did you use? Asking about that in a positive manner. Or perhaps a person has made gains in their attitude and behaviors, and ask them, hey, remember last week? There was some chaos, there was a fight. Now I see that you're blowing up his lesson. What's changed? How did you make an improvement? Or hey, previously I saw that you were quite angry, but now I see that you're modulating your feelings better. How did you make those improvements? When an improvement happens for a person, they're able to calm down, or perhaps they previously would have blow-ups that would last for hours upon hours. However, now an argument lasts 10 minutes and then it stops and the person calms down. Ask them, how did you do that? You're calming down quickly now. It's not ongoing with blow-ups and anger. What are you doing? What skills are you using for that? Can you tell me? Or perhaps a person has a big argument or fight with a person, and then later they're able to sit down, they're willing to apologize and have a discussion using clean communication with mutual respect, no insults, having those clean conversations now. Having those dialogues using the express self-safety skill, meaning you're able to express yourself well. Wow. Asking the person, how did you improve? What did you do? The first time I ask the question, how, oftentimes clients don't know how to answer because it is abstract. Often I will ask repetitively, how? What skills did you use? To where eventually the client becomes comfortable with answering, oh, I use my shielding skill, or I use the red, yellow, green light skill. I use turn taking. And that ability to answer what skill they're employing will help them have new storytelling about themselves, that I can do it. I can express myself safely. I can make friendships. I can do things independently. And they develop that sense of I can do it. Asking questions promotes thinking skills and problem solving. I like to use a problem solving skill called share the dilemma. I'll sit down with a client and say, hey, I'm feeling stuck. Perhaps I'm at a group home again. And someone comes up to me and they say, I want to go shopping right now. But the problem is other clients are not wanting to go shopping and I'm the only staff. And so I sit down and I share the dilemma and I tell the client, I have a problem. Do you mind helping me? You want to go out shopping and it's important, I know that. The problem is I'm the only staff. And what do the other clients want? They want to stay here. I want to be able to drive you to go shopping, but how would that make the other clients feel? I'm the only staff here. Could you help me? Involve the client in problem solving. Another problem that comes up often is related to driving. Two clients begin arguing about who gets to sit where in the car. And sometimes staff will just tell them, you sit here, you sit in the back. But really, the two clients should be able to resolve that between themselves. It's not rocket science. And so I share the dilemma. I have one seat here and one seat in the back. There's not enough room for all of us to sit up front. What do? Can you help me? And you give people the chance to work it out themselves. They work it out, and then I can comment, wow, you've resolved the problem on your own. What skills did you use? Turn-taking skills? Clean communication skills? Discussion and agreement skills? Wow. Sharing the dilemma gives people the opportunity to be involved in problem solving, and as an end result, you're able to comment, wow, you were able to help me solve the problem. What did you do? What skills did you use? And so now I'd like to summarize. We work with humility. This is difficult work. Most of us need help. It is rare to find someone that has all the communication skills necessary. Most of us can't do it alone, and we need communication supports. And again, I recommend that we approach this as teamwork and not individual work. And I caution you against becoming the super therapist. It won't last. My thinking process and my model for this is developmental work. In working with a person who has language delays, cognitive delays, psychosocial skill delays, they're behind on information, we have to match their developmental level. We have to help them develop as much as possible. If we want to see people progress, we have to recognize that some will make gains with their language and others may not, but we want to promote that development. That language and cognitive development has to occur before they're ready to discuss problems. Stories within therapy is an excellent tool. Building language through stories. Sometimes it's strictly conversation. Tell me more. What happened next? What happened before that? Who, what, where, when? Show interest. And that helps people develop their story and at the same time develop their thinking abilities too. Involvement and inviting people to learn skills. That is a good model for therapy. Not trying to understand themselves in an abstract way, but involvement of skills. And remembering those coping skills related to their internal feelings, as well as their social skills and interactions with people. Those are critical skill areas to focus on in therapy. In terms of deaf-friendly techniques, I mentioned 3 things: using pictures, examples, and role play. All 3 are used often, and it's natural within our field to use those, and it's quite helpful. Always, our ability to empathize and develop relationships is key. And I encourage you in general to use more questions and less authority and power by controlling or telling. Involving the person in problem solving and using their thinking skills. Everything that I've touched upon in this presentation involves deaf mental health care. And if you're interested, these are 3 books I can recommend. There are others. This is Counseling with Deaf People and Language Learning Issues. 2 more texts related to that. Finally, I'd like to end with a picture. I like this picture quite a bit. There's a psychologist by the name of Johannes Fellinger that drew this picture. If you notice, there's 2 archways or doorways. One is quite large and one is quite small, and it's related to the access of mental health care. The large archway is the general population, meaning that there's many options for them to access. You notice they all have red backpacks, which relates to the number of problems they have. And you see that their backpacks are relatively small. With the smaller archway, that refers to the number of services available to deaf people. There's very few. And you notice that their red backpacks they're carrying may be quite large. They may come with quite a few problems. And then you add language deprivation to the mix. How many services do people with language limits actually have? Almost nothing. The red backpacks that they carry with them may continue to get larger. And that means that if you're interested in this type of therapy, we need you. We need your involvement. The deaf community needs your involvement. Thank you for watching this presentation. If you have any feedback, thoughts, suggestions, please get in touch with me and let me know. This is still a relatively new field. I'm not the expert. We developed the field together. I greatly appreciate your feedback. Please don't hesitate to do so, and you'll see my contact on the next slide. Thank you.